Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another interview and reading with Space Cowboy Books Online. I am your host, Jean-Paul Garnier, and today we are fortunate enough to have S.Z. Attwell, also known as Sabrina, with her book Aeostus. My Latin's no good, so I probably pronounced that wrong. S.C. Attwell lives in New England, though she was raised in the Pacific Northwest and still misses the open land and her cats. She is a professional science writer with an MA in media studies and web graphic design editing experience, but her real love has always been fiction writing. In her spare time, she does photography, archery, among other things. You can find her on social media as well as at her website, where I will put a link in the chat right now. So without further delay, I'm going to hand it over to Sabrina to share an excerpt of the novel, and then we will be getting into the interview and any audience questions. Over to you, Sabrina.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. So I have here, well, I have both my books here just to show you the covers. So this is my first novel ever. It's a sci-fi dystopian climate fiction book. And I want to read, let's see, I want to read the first little bit. Let's see, the very beginning, and then if I have time, a little bit from further on. Excuse me. So the first bit is the preface. So 15 years ago, Jossie scrambled up the side of the condenser pod and sat under the desert sky, looking at the glitter of stars. She winced at the squeak of Tark's shoes on the sleek metal curve of the pod. This one was older, maybe a century or more, but still in good condition. Shipshape, Father would say, though the phrase meant nothing to her. It was one of those strange things grown-ups said. The steel pod gleamed in the starlight. She hoped that Ulnar wouldn't see two figures sitting here. Tark plunked down beside her, floppy hair shoved out of his face. You scared now? He hissed. Shut up. She was, but she didn't dare show it. Tark was 13 and didn't let her forget that she was only 10. She pretended to be nonchalant, but strained to hear over the soft whooshing of the condenser motors. She wasn't quite sure she believed the Ulnar existed, always half wondered if those were stories made to keep children obedient, like the monster under the bed, but if Father caught them. But the stars. They seemed to move, to shimmer, in the burning air above the horizon. Even at midnight, it was hot, like the slow, excuse me, sorry. Even at midnight, it was hot, like the slow glowing of an oven that has been left open to cool. The land was punctuated by rock spires and deep canyons that Tark said the Ulnar used to hide during the daytime. Above her rose a massive arc of stardust and shining distant regions, seeming to twist its way across the July sky. She reached out her hand as if to touch it. Father used to jokingly say that the atmosphere hadn't exactly turned into Venusian fumes after the years of extreme heat began. She didn't know what Venusian meant, but it sounded bad. Instead, it seemed to have expanded in the heat, an enormous bubble wobbling and making the stars appear to shimmer and dance, glittering orange and pale shades of pink, melting into the horizon. Tark glanced over his shoulder at the deep hole in the side of one of the spires. The glint of the machinery shone there in the starlight, the elevator. The pair had snuck out upside using it, the result of hours of Tark exploring the city's abandoned upper tunnels with his friends. It was a crankshaft model from the old days, nearly rusted beyond repair, and just unsealed enough for a group of boys to be able to break in. Of course, none but Tark had been brave enough to risk a trip in such a rattling bucket up to the surface, or really anywhere. None but Gavin, his best friend, and his little sister. She looked up again, searching for the moon, and slid to the left. Tark gripped her arm. Careful! She glanced down and saw, beneath her dangling feet, the edge. It was a 25-foot fall. She shivered and scooted closer to her older brother. They were up there because Jossie had asked to see the moon. She'd seen it in videos, of course. She'd also seen paintings her father had done, from memory, of the surface when it hadn't been quite so hot. There was one of a sunset. There was even one of a tree, a tiny scrub-like thing Father had seen once as a boy, rising out of the sandy ground. From time to time he would talk about it and wonder, the insistence of life on survival above ground. The pictures lined the interior of their small living chamber, next to the portrait of the rose Mother had given him on their wedding day. None of them had ever seen a rose. It was a symbol of Mother's family. But Jossie had never seen anything other than the daylight sky, and that only when Father let her tag along on engineering trips up to the surface, telling her that she needed to pay attention to the machinery and to leave the landscape to patrol. She had seen something white in the sky on that trip, and Father had explained to her that that was the moon, and it was often out at night, and she had stared because it looked like a little planet floating up there in the blue. She had asked if it was cool up there, and Father had said he didn't know. So she had asked to see the moon, and Tark, who never said no to his little sister and who explored the scariest tunnels, even the ones the guards didn't want to go into, shrugged his head. Okay. Now they were sitting up on top of a condenser pod, the sweet smelling night air drifting past them. Tark's eyes were bright, almost silver, under a mop of blonde hair. There it is, he whispered. He pointed his skinny arm across the canyons, across the dark lands to the east. The moon floated low on the horizon, a few days past full, looking faded as time carved a shadow into its yellow face. Jossie stared at it, amazed. It was like an entire world was there in the air before them. It was so beautiful that Jossie forgot all about the Onlar, forgot about father, forgot even that Tark was holding her wrist so she wouldn't slide off the pod. She was brought back to reality when his hand tightened over her arm. She started to complain, but he hushed her, gray eyes enormous in the faint light as he stared past her. Then she turned to look, and she wasn't sure which of them was screaming. Patrol found her the next day, draped across the base of the machine under the burning summer sun, nearly dead from dehydration. She had a massive bleeding cut across her eye, and her femur had partly splintered on impact with the machine. Surgeons later told her it was a wonder she had survived. For weeks, while she recovered in the hospital, Jossie screamed about green eyes, but otherwise refused to talk about what she had seen. And despite their best search efforts, Tark was gone. Do you want me to continue this part, or I can go to the next section?
I'll leave that to your discretion, either way.
Okay. You said about 10 minutes, so I'm trying to, let's see.
Yeah, I'm not going to cut you off if you want to keep reading, so go right ahead.
So let's see. And why not? First part. So present day. The tunnels were burning. Jossie stood watching the condensation running down the rough-hewn walls in the flickering light, waiting for the shuttle to come and take her deeper underground to the safe zone. The fans were on down far below, a constant blasting in the background, but the air was barely moving. She fumbled in her bag for the tin of water, reassuring herself for the fifth time that it was there. Sweat poured from her and from the other workers staring dead-eyed at the floor wall, waiting for the evening transport to arrive. It wasn't like the shuttle to be this late. Storms were already rocking the atmosphere above them, and the thunder could be heard dully above the fans deep in the tunnels. She hoped she had enough water to last if the transport were delayed again. Jossie checked this red safety gauge on her wrist. 110 degrees, and that was cooler than it had been earlier in the day, before the storms. She wiped at her forehead, tried to make herself more comfortable without actually opening the tin. Water had to be strictly rationed. The ground beneath them shook as thunder sounded above. The storms had arrived earlier than ever this year, and she hoped she was up for another week in the solar plant. At least they paid well, she thought, and someone had to do it, even if they had to deal with the awful transportation. Her giant duffel was uncomfortable against her long ago injured leg, which still ached when the pressure was low like this. She hiked the straps further onto her shoulders, grimacing. She glanced around. The two solar crews were scattered in clumps, some sitting on their bags, some huddling near the walls and morosely watching the condensation drip. At least today there'd been a bit of respite. One of the families in the other solar crew had just had a baby, so the new father had brought some treats up top with him. Just about anything to take their minds off the start of the storm season and their daytime banishment from walking the solar farm border with its slightly cooler canyons. It was dangerous during electrical storms, especially with all that tall metal equipment out there. Not that the canyons were that safe either, but at least they were outside, not cooped up in the control box. Despite the blazing heat, it was always hard to come back down after a day above. Jossie especially hated this shuttle stop and how dim it was. To save energy, the city had cut the lights up near the surface, and workers were expected to bring their own illumination for emergency purposes. That meant that the end of their shift found them all huddled in a blazing hot tunnel next to the only light source from here to the first safety gate hundreds of feet below. Try to walk from here, and you'd be in pitch darkness all the way down, with only your little clip-on red safety light to illuminate the path, following the spiraling edge of a pit with a guardrail that Jossie didn't trust to keep a bus on the road. She shook her head and tried not to think about the darkness below them. Usually it didn't bother her. She slept on her long journey down into the earth. But she did wish the transport would be more on time because her safety gauge pinged and began to glow a faint orange, beginning of sunset. She fidgeted and looked around. The transport's delay was now more than just annoying. Another 20 minutes and the sun should be fully down. She hoped patrol would be manning the outside tunnel entrance tonight. A faint clanking sounded farther up in the tunnels, barely audible over the noise of the fans. The transport, she thought, relieved, peering into the dimness, but the noise sounded off somehow, as if one of the tires were worn down almost to the rim. She covered her other ear and squinted, straining to make out the sound. Then there was a sharper sound, almost like a backfire, that resounded up and down the tunnel. Someone next to her, Adam, she thought, sighed. New driver, he grumbled. They always run the gears too hard. Jossie glanced at the time. 26 minutes late. Too close to the risk window, much too close. She could hear the atmosphere rumbling above her, elemental, sounding as if the storms were about to break. There was a horrible mechanical screech from very close up the tunnel, and the clattering sound came again. Everyone's head shot up as the transport shuddered its way into view. Finally, muttered an old man who had taken up refuge on one of the half-hewn benches and was fanning himself with his workman's cap. Jossie half smirked. He was a machinist with her solar crew. She'd never heard him utter a word. She looked over toward the approaching vehicle as people started shifting, gathering bags, getting into a semblance of a line. Her smile disappeared. The entire transport was listening to the side. The lights in the interior were dim, and the driver seemed not to see the waiting group, inching forward, then slamming on the brakes, as if just realizing they were there. Jossie's skin prickled. The driver looked not right. He was middle-aged, probably ex-patrol, tasked with the boring yet necessary job of shuttling workers to the surface to keep the condensers functioning. He was one of several. Jossie thought she recognized him, but today he looked wild-eyed at them as if they weren't there, as if he thought he were seeing things. She glanced at the tires, but it was too dark in the flickering single light at the stop to see if anything was wrong. The door swung open and they shuffled on. The driver didn't look at them. His face was a strange shade of gray. Jossie blinked and hoped it was the port lighting. She waited until everyone else from her crew was on, counting them off. Then she climbed on, dragging her heavy bag, and took a seat near the front. The door hissed shut, and the yellowish lights inside the transport buzzed and flickered. With a rumble and a clunk, the transport trundled downward into the underground night. The headlights barely pushed back the inky blackness, two beams slicing across the jagged-hewn rock walls and into nothingness beyond. Jossie held her bag tightly, feeling distinctly on edge. Usually the darkness was familiar, a fact of life to those who lived underground, as she knew that patrol should be operating for another hour or so. But the tunnel's stone walls seemed discolored, like the driver's face, as she shook her head, concentrating instead on her own reflection in the darkened windows. Her eyes shadowed, the left brown, the right an icy blue-green, a scar slicing across her brow and her eye and coming to rest on her cheek. Her face was thin, almost pinched, with the pointed jaw and pale skin. She was barely 25, but she felt much older. Her uniform read Solar Crew 23, Leader, reflected backward in the glass. She always felt dry, exhausted, when she came down from the blistering heat of the outside. She frowned and turned back to the view through the windshield, staring ahead into the tunnels. The driver still seemed to be on autopilot, big hands clumsy on the wheel, heavy shoulders hunched. The other passengers seemed nervous as well. Normally some of them made light conversation, but this evening they were dead silent. The transport shuddered as the driver overcorrected for no discernible reason and veered to the left. He gripped the wheel so hard his knuckles turned white and slowed down to a snail's pace. Jossie felt the juddering of the brakes beneath her feet, could smell the dust from the tunnels as it filtered through the transport's old intake system. Before them, the headlights disappeared quickly, swallowed up into total blackness. On the boundary of light and dark, through the dusty windows, she thought she saw movement. If the Olnar come, don't move. Make yourself small. They can see you in the dark. Jossie turned away, spine tingling, before she could let herself look too closely at the darkness. She watched the driver's hands nervously. The air felt cooler down here, the humidity lessening as they descended, but she felt clammy and strange and cold, skin prickling. She glanced around, thought maybe others had the same consuming urge to get out and run. But they were trapped inside their little bubble of half-functioning light. The transport hissed as it clanked its way deeper into the earth. The lights continued to buzz and flicker, and she realized she could hear a strange dragging sound. It was almost as if a piece of the transport had come off and was bumping against the rocky floor of the tunnel behind them. She stood, hesitant, and approached the driver. Excuse me. The driver nearly jumped out of his seat at being addressed, but kept his eyes focused on the tunnel ahead. Jossie jumped too, startled. The passengers behind her shifted uneasily. Over the eerie silence, she heard a steady whispering coming from him. She realized he was muttering what sounded like some kind of prayer. Excuse me, she began again. I hear something. There's some kind of... The driver hunched further, away from her, and began to mutter more feverishly. She paused, listening more closely. She couldn't identify the sound. It didn't quite sound like metal. It was almost as if a heavy bag had caught on the fender. Someone's belongings, maybe, left behind at the stop. She frowned, trying to make it out. Something else. A scraping. Slight, persistent. The clammy feeling was worse now. She stepped forward again, opened her mouth to try again. At that moment, with a clunk and a thud, the dragging noise ceased. At the sound, the driver flinched as if someone had struck him with one of those patrol wands. As Jossie watched, he half glanced over his shoulder, face gray and eyes wild. Before she could look back to see what had been causing the noise, he stomped on the accelerator. The transport, much too old for this type of treatment, groaned and hissed as it picked up speed. Jossie frantically grabbed for a handhold and whipped around, but the transport didn't have a back window. She suddenly found she did not want to see whatever had fallen. She staggered as the transport hit the beginning of a curve and her bag tipped to the floor, spilling the contents everywhere. She yelled for the man to stop, using her foot to scoop her things into a pile while trying to keep her balance. She couldn't afford to lose anything, not here, not in the dark. Sir! The driver ignored her. Leave it, he was muttering under his breath. Sir! Someone joined in. Now the crowd on the transport seemed terrified. Stop the shuttle! The ground rumbled, excuse me, the ground rumbled beneath them and the headlights wove wildly as they bumped over the rocky tunnel floor, careening into blackness. Jossie looked out the right side window as they turned a corner, behind them, and thought she saw something in the distance, a long shape on the tunnel floor. Jossie turned back to the driver, pleading, joined by a chorus of voices. Please stop the shuttle! Suddenly the driver began to gurgle, a wheezing sharp gasp seeming to come from somewhere deep inside. He reached feebly for the dash controls and slumped forward, motionless. People started screaming. The young woman behind Jossie was whimpering, holding her bag in front of her like a shield. The driver's foot was stuck on the accelerator. Jossie abandoned her bag and stumbled forward, hitting her shoulder sharply on one of the hold bars as she dove to the floor and shoved the man's foot off the pedal. There was no brake pedal, excuse me. There was no brake pedal, none that she could see. One of the other solar crew, a tall young man with glasses, pulled his way forward, stepping over people's spilled belongings and touched the man's neck. He's breathing, the passenger announced. Get him out of the way, Jossie gasped, grabbing for the steering wheel. It was heavy, rubber-coated metal, and it jerked out of her hands as she tried to pull the transport into a straighter course. The young man complied, manhandling the driver to the floor as she flailed for the wheel. Everything was shaking. She could barely sit down without falling. She looked frantically for a brake, an emergency stop, anything. The transport was rattling too hard for her to make out the labels on the dash, the light above the driver's seat flickering over the dashboard. Her teeth were shaking in her head as the tires bounced over the rocky tunnel floor. Anyone know how to stop this thing? She yelled, looking over her shoulder. A sea of silent gray faces met her. She looked at the young man. You? He had pulled himself to his feet and was holding onto one of the bars. He shook his head, staring at the unconscious man on the floor. Well, try. He examined the instrument panel, then grabbed a lever and yanked on it. A horrible hissing sound and the door swung open. Beside him, she could hear the loud reverberations of tires on rock bouncing back into the vehicle. Try another. She gripped the steering wheel, feeling the vehicle shuddering as it bounced over the rock. Somewhere, even over the noise of the transport, she could hear rushing water, an underground river, one that helped keep the city functioning, currently flooded by the summer storms. She knew that meant they were nearing the top of the giant spiral in the pit. There was a slight up incline close to here, she remembered, and then a steep drop. If they could hit that up incline, they might be okay. She gritted her teeth, took her eyes from the road, and looked at the instrument panel. Still nothing that said brake. What kind of stupid system is this? She hissed. The young man pressed another button. With a groan, the transport shuddered, then the brakes engaged. He staggered, reaching desperately for the nearest handhold. Jossie felt the wind leave her as she was slammed into the seatbelt. Sparks flew outside the windows, steel shrieking against steel. In the headlights, Jossie could see the arm of the spiral approaching, a steep incline to the right with a drop-off hundreds of feet into a frighteningly deep pit. The guardrail looked extremely flimsy against several tons of solid steel. She closed her eyes and prayed. The bus rolled more and more slowly, then shuddered to a stop and went silent as the engine disengaged. Then the vehicle turned off, leaving them in total blackness. So that's the beginning. And then, let's see. I could technically read a bit more, but I don't want to use up too much time. So whatever you think.
That's your decision, Sabrina. We do have the interview to get through, but if you want to share a little bit more, that's totally okay. And just so the audience knows, you're welcome to throw your questions in the chat for later as well.
The other part I was thinking about reading, let me just see how many pages it is, because give me a second. Where is it? Okay. Well, I can read half a chapter, a couple chapters. Okay, so this is Wickford, who's one of the patrol. Patrol is like the military of the city. And Wickford is regretting his decision, let me put it that way. He's not excited to be doing what he's doing. They lined up along the ridge and crouched, silent shadows staring down into the valley. They made sure to check that the moon was on the other side of the sky so they couldn't easily be seen. The elevator felt very far away. They can see you in the dark. It was true, knew Wickford, but they could try to keep the advantage. Up here, the wind was blasting harshly, warm even at night and very dry. The only vegetation around was deep in the canyons where there was water. The ridge was clean of cover, burned during the day and wind scoured at night. Water, the commander murmured. They obediently took a swig from their canisters. It had to be timed to keep them all sufficiently rationed to make the full loop of whatever mission council had set them on this time. Wickford had only been on one of these above ground missions before, though he fought alongside Schoolis and Henry down in the tunnels for the past year. Commander Schoolis never told them much, just gave them brief orders before they moved out. Usually the above ground patrol went through the canyons, driving out any Olar they could find, or so Henry had explained when Wickford had volunteered for duty. And he'd only done it on a dare from Henry, of course, who'd called him a chicken in the mess hall in front of everyone, saying tunnel duty was for patrolettes. Newbies, Wickford thought sourly. But fighting Olar on their home turf was sounding less and less great with every minute that passed as it dawned on him that they might actually be going into the canyons. The stars might be beautiful and cool air was always welcome, but he thought that he strongly preferred the tunnels. That way your enemy was only on one side of you. He kept his thoughts to himself and off his face. The commander was frighteningly good at noticing any dissent. Schoolis raised a hand suddenly, mask shining eerily in the moonlight. Quadrant 4, he whispered into his comm. Do you copy? A faint buzzing that meant copy. Schoolis whispered in something into his comm. Then he resumed study of the valley below. Okay. The ridge they were standing on was vertically edged along the eastern face. Flat sides sloped, notched with half-formed caves to the valley floor. The wind hissed in the sand. Below them, the valley spread out in a semicircle, pocked with holes and rivulets where flash floods had carved their way over the centuries. When it rained here, it poured, Wickford knew. Patrol lost a man or two every year to the deluges. He glanced at the sky. It was clear. Beyond the flat valley, the canyon entrances yawned, parallel gashes in the earth. They wound their way toward the horizon. The Olar, that's where their caves began. The canyons were pitch black. Patrol would be at a huge disadvantage against creatures they could see in the dark. Wickford shivered, suddenly deeply regretting whatever it was he'd signed up for. Last time had been a routine patrol of the general perimeter of the city's multiple tunnel entrances, far away from any canyons. This time, he wasn't sure, and he hated that. Schoolis was still silent. He appeared to be thinking. Wickford adjusted his water pack, wincing at the sloshing sound. Henry shot him a look. Then the tiger glanced at the glowing dial on his wrist, turned it off, and crouched and began to draw in the sand. Wickford watched closely, but not too closely. Patrol commanders often didn't like their troops to be too inquisitive about their projects, Wickford called them. Schoolis was no exception. Wickford just followed orders. It was easier. But he was curious nonetheless. From what he could see, Schoolis was drawing a straight line with angles fanning out, a jagged line that might represent one of the numerous canyons in the area, and what looked like a circle off to the right, though what that might be, Wickford could not guess. Schoolis stood, glanced up at the moon again, raising his thumb and index finger against the horizon, palm flat out, as if calculating something. Then he crouched again and swept a wide divot in the sand with his hand. It covered half of one of the maybe canyons. He showed the design of the tracker, who gestured in agreement. The commander stood, smeared the drawing with his foot, and looked dead ahead into the nearest canyon, tall figure even more frightening against the light of the moon. They made their way single file down the ridge. Wickford moved slowly, trailing after the group, trying not to make noise as his feet scraped the gravelly sandstone. Every so often, Henry would glance back at him. Wickford guessed Pricey was paying attention, was probably thinking how incompetent Wickford was that Henry had to check on him, but he didn't care. Henry and Wickford had been best friends since 6th grade. Henry had insisted they join patrol together, even though Wickford was slower, clumsier, and louder, he thought, wincing. But he gave Henry a thumbs up and tried not to trip on the rocks. Spread out, Schoolis said quietly as they entered one of the pitch black canyons. This canyon's unmapped. We need to look for sign. Sign meant Olar Caves, Olar Tracks. Henry silently headed to the right, Schoolis to the left. That left Wickford following Pricey over the stony ground. Every so often, Pricey would stop, crouch, touch the ground, move a stone or two. Wickford couldn't tell what the older patrol was doing, but he couldn't let Pricey of all people know that. They continued on, silent dark figures moving through the near blackness. Wickford found himself watching the sky, the stars, as they disappeared one at a time over the bumpy rim of the canyon. He'd steeled himself long ago to the dark, yet somehow the half-light scared him more. But he needed 2 night missions above ground to qualify for tunnel duty near the city. And there was that stupid dare with Henry. He looked around as he walked, trailing Pricey. The stone here was worn down over centuries, millennia maybe. Wickford didn't know, hadn't really cared to know about this type of thing when he was in patrol school. But now he was curious as to why it was so lumpy, like dozens of fingers sticking out of the ground, each so big that 20 men could encircle it. In the sunlight, he knew, the spires were striped, different shades of rock worn down over time. And the rock at night was almost cold, beautifully so. He wanted to lean on it, even in this chilly air. No wonder the Olar lived in caves. He fell behind a little as they made their slow way down the canyon. He felt a little better now, safer. His eyes were beginning to adjust, and he could see well enough to tell that this canyon was likely abandoned. It was bone dry, for one thing, and the steep angle of the sides meant that the sun would probably hit the ground at maximum intensity for more hours during the day than was safe. He had read his safety manuals, he thought proudly, even if he hadn't had much of a chance to go above ground. As he drifted over the rocky canyon floor, he looked for sign which could be anything out of place, a trail over the rocks, a pattern of gravel fall that looked unnatural. The Olar didn't leave clear tracks for the most part, but if he knew what to look for, he glanced up and stopped in his tracks. The canyon had turned while he'd been wandering, and it now opened onto the glowing path of the Milky Way in all its stunning shimmering glory. For a moment, Wickford forgot where he was. He'd only heard of it. It hadn't been visible the last time he'd been up above. He gaped. With me, Schoolis' voice drifted back, startling Wickford. The young patrol looked up, then behind him, at the nearly invisible entrance to the canyon. He suddenly realized how far behind he was, how isolated. Henry was all but invisible up ahead in the darkness, the medic trailing after him. Schoolis had taken the tracker with him and couldn't even be seen. Even Pricey. Behind him, Wickford thought he heard a sound. A trickle of rock, a footstep maybe. His fascination with the Milky Way vanished, replaced by gut-wrenching terror. The Olar could be there, right behind him, maybe even a group, and he was alone. His hands felt like ice. He broke into a run, scrambling over the rocks as he made a beeline for the others. As he did, he tripped over something and went flying, making a racket as he went down hard, his gear scattering. The entire group of patrol turned around. "It's the newbie," he heard one of them mutter angrily. He lay there, frozen. He'd lost his canteen and his knife. He'd heard them both fall somewhere in the darkness. Schoolis would probably be furious, he thought. But Wickford didn't care because he was staring at a skull. Okay, that's it.
Thank you for sharing those excerpts of the book with us. Um, so in the book, there's a lot of really wonderful characters, and there's a lot of really strong world building. In a way, it almost feels like a space opera, even though it takes place here on Earth. So I wanted to ask you, when dealing with world building, do you first build your world, or do you work on your characters first? And how do those two affect each other during your writing?
So I could honestly talk about this for probably an hour, so I have to restrain myself. But honestly, I started out with this story with a concept, which was that I was waiting in a bus tunnel, extremely annoyed because the bus was very late and it was really hot and it was storming, etc. So that first chapter is based on direct experience. But and then I was thinking, it's 90, it was 95 degrees or something outside and like 90% humidity because of the storms. And I was thinking, if God forbid, if this gets worse, where are we supposed to go? We can't all flee north. I mean, maybe. And what are we supposed to do? And so I thought, well, where could we go? North, underground? And then I thought, well, what if this bus is coming to take me home from work underground? And then I started thinking, how would that work? How many people could, what are the implications? What dangers would they face? Where would they get water? All of that. So I started really thinking about, like, speculative fiction wise. I started really getting into the details of how a city would function. In terms of the characters, my characters underwent a significant change in terms of I only had Jossie to begin with, and I really had no idea who any of the rest of them were. I just had this person, and she was in this bus, and I didn't, I had this idea of this thing that happens to her, but I didn't have an idea of anyone else at all. In fact, one of the major characters, Gavin, who's her friend slash bodyguard, kind of, not really, it's a long story, but anyway, he started out as filler because when I first started writing this, I had no idea what I was doing and I needed to make a scene longer. So I tossed him in, and then he became this giant major character. It was like dropping a boulder into a puddle in terms of how it messed up my plans. So I had a concept, I had ideas about, you know, what I have found and what happened as I did world building. Everything builds on everything else. So the characters are reacting to their own motivations. They're reacting to what happens in the external world. But a lot of the events kind of are consequences of the characters' decisions. And so as I've gone through and as I'm writing more, I found it works almost better to have a sort of general concept and then use the characters to build it.
And here's a question from Krista in the audience. How much of the original world that you imagined waiting for that bust changed by the final draft of the book?
Honestly, not very much, surprisingly, because I think that the concept, um, I think I can spoil this. It's not a spoiler because I think you had a question later on about the language in the book. So I was thinking, where have people already done this? Where have people already lived underground? And so I set it in that area, and I did a lot of research on that geographic region. So a lot of it was kind of set up already in terms of the concept of the story. I didn't know what was going on until I started writing it, like as I went. So not much surprisingly changed.
And the book takes place after some sort of cataclysmic climate issue. Um, I've heard a lot of people say because of today and going through the pandemic and how it's affected all of us, that the pandemic is generally going to kill dystopian fiction. I wonder if you have found this to be true, and in releasing a book, a dystopian book, how has it been received during these times?
So that's an interesting question, actually. I think that, and I have not written a book about disease specifically, so I do wonder if it's had an effect on that, just because people either would be maybe really fascinated or not want to read it at all. You know what I mean? Um, for me, I mean, it's such a it's climate fiction, but it's not primarily about the climate. That's kind of the staging of it, I guess. I ended up using it as much more of a the dystopian aspect. So I think dystopian in the sense of man-made, like not necessarily disease or things that are exacerbated by behavior and whatnot. But I think that um, the things that I talk about in my book are very much reflections on power dynamics and how how societies function naturally. How do I say this? Like without outside anything really. I mean, just how people organize themselves or can organize themselves, and the ramifications of things like that. So I'm not even sure. I call it climate fiction, but I'm not sure I would classify it specifically as in the same type of fiction as to do with pandemics and things like that.
I have a feeling dystopian fiction and post-apocalyptic fiction is not going to go away. We still have to
Probably.
have this. We have to have this conversation. The worse things get, the more we need to have this conversation. So
Hmm.
you also work as a science writer. How
Hmm.
has this affected your writing of science fiction? And if you want to talk a little bit about your science writing, feel free to get into that as well.
Yeah, so as a science writer, I do a lot of quote unquote translating science into lay descriptions, I guess you could say. Like one time I used to work in a physics department, and I still am not entirely sure what this article was about. I did this nice little portrait of this researcher and I said, "Oh, tell me about your research." An hour later, I am frantically typing deer in the headlights look, and I still didn't, and I basically said, "Is this correct?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Great, I'm publishing it." But generally speaking, I mean, he was talking about things like how matter, and antimatter formed and why there's X amount of one versus the other and all this, and just terminology that far beyond me. But generally speaking, science writing allows me to ask the right questions, do the right research, and then explain it in a way that makes sense. But is also accurate, which is always the challenge. And so when I was thinking about this book and, how many people could live underground, et cetera, all of that, I had to do some research, but then it, present it in such a way that is not info dumpy. So I have, you can laugh, I call it my microwave rule. So if I'm writing a book or writing a story about my kitchen, for example, there is no reason for me to describe my microwave or other technology unless said technology is currently on fire. Like, I wouldn't notice it. It's just there. It's normal. And so anything to do with futuristic technology, the science writer in me wants to describe it, but the science fiction writer, I only describe what's immediately relevant to the characters. Um, as much fun as it is to go into great depth about whatever hovercrafts and things, I'm not going to go out and say, "Ooh, look at my air conditioner. Let me describe in great detail." So it's always that sort of fine line while also giving accurate descriptions.
And here's another question from the audience. This one is from Margaret.
Mhm.
What was your hardest scene to write and why?
Ooh. Of course, my brain is going to book two, which I really can't talk about because giant spoilers. Let me think about that. I don't want to, I mean, not emotionally hardest, but one of the hardest to write was what I consider major spoiler number two. And that was because the scene was in my head for months. And I finally got to it and I thought, okay, I have to write it down. What if I mess it up? And so I didn't avoid it exactly, but it was just a lot of pressure on myself to get it exactly as it was in my head. And I think I did, but that was really tough.
And this book also addresses the after effects of colonialism. It goes into resource distribution, food security. Can you tell us a little about your inspirations for taking on these themes and maybe your personal feelings towards these issues?
Yeah. So in terms of, so at the sort of very beginning, so Jossie, after I can't tell you exactly what happens in the tunnels, but there's stuff that happens, and then she ends up being pulled onto patrol. Like her uncle is the minister of intelligence, and he wants her to join patrol after she manages to save these people. And of course, she's like, "No, why would I do that? This is terrifying, and I don't like the dark. And you know what happened to me? Like, why would you ask me to do that?" Basically, but she ends up on patrol, and so she slowly ends up seeing more aspects of how the city functions. And she's aware that, so Gavin, again, is her good friend, and he's a patrol commander. So he's been fighting this basically terrorist group called Karpatai, that basically she's not 100% clear on what their platform or whatever is, but she kind of grasps that they have this idea that the city is declining and that there's some issues with food distribution and whatever, but she doesn't really understand why they think this, because she's like, I help run the city, it's fine, it's functioning fine, what is your problem? And so it's just slowly, as people get a broader perspective on what's happening, and they see the things that underpin their society. And so in part I was thinking of how modern society works in supply chains, and who is picking your strawberries and that type of thing, like things that we don't really necessarily think about, or labor inequity or anything like that. um and so those things exist, and so but it's very easy to just not see them. And so I tried to be more, let me have the characters slowly start to reflect on things like this, for example.
It would do us well as a culture to look behind the scenes a little more in that way. Um, can you tell us a little bit about the use of Turkish in the book?
Yeah, so first of all, I speak terrible Turkish, like very A1, like I'm working on it. Um, because of where I placed the book, I wanted there to be some connection, for example, with the landscape and with the people who had been there before, and just because the city basically was a project. So a bunch of very wealthy people were just like, all right, goodbye, rest of the world. You all have fun fighting this out. We are going to the desert and burying ourselves basically, and just blocking out everything else. And so, for example, some of the surnames in the city come from Turkish because the people that were there and showed them how to survive and whatever, and helped them with building the city and all of that, became absorbed into their city, I guess. And so I wanted there to be a little bit of a sense that time had passed, and there was still a world out there, but it was just kind of natural progression, I guess, from that. It's also just fun to add other languages, especially ones that I speak.
It was wonderful to read a book that doesn't take place in the United States too. We don't get enough of that. So trying not to get into spoilers too much here, but you decided to end the book as sort of a cliffhanger. What inspired you to do this instead of making it a standalone book?
So, this is the book. This is the original book. As you can see, it is quite large. In my head, this is still the book, like it's one book for me. So I had to split it. And the point that made sense happened to also be, sorry everyone, a giant cliffhanger. But technically, and I made sure before I did this, the arc does actually end. It just also goes into the next bit. Um, but that was basically it. It was just looking at it and thinking physically, I don't think I can print this. Like I think this goes beyond. And I mean, I want to add more, but for now, this is sort of story piece 1.0.
That makes a lot of sense. And I did not mean to suggest in any way that the book does not have a perfect dramatic arc,
Oh no,
because it does. It absolutely does. So, again, without spoilers, can you tell us a little bit about book two, The Colony?
yeah. So the colony. Okay, yeah. Let me think how to do this because it took me a while to write this blurb, and even then, just none of you should look at book two's summary. Just trust me. um, I specifically linked to book one and only book one on my Twitter because of that. But book two, oh, how do I describe book two? I may have to come back to that because I'm actually not sure how to do that without ruining anything. Sorry.
Fair enough. We're here to celebrate book one. So, I'm sure those that read book one will be finding out book two for themselves too. So we have another couple audience questions here. This one is from Margaret again. What risks have you taken with your writing that have paid off?
Well, one thing is I didn't even try to research genre or anything. I just wrote and I just kept writing until it was done. Like how do I put this? Yeah, I mean I just kind of instinctively went with stuff. Like when, for example, Gavin, who Mr. Filler and now Mr. Giant Main Character, I did not plan for him to have any role. He was literally just I needed her to be in the hospital, and and again I didn't know what I was doing when I first started writing. The longest thing I'd ever written before this, not counting my master's thesis, was probably 50 pages at max. And in my head, a novel was always 200 pages plus, and I always thought, how do you get from that to 200 pages? I don't understand. And now I'm like, how do I not write 1900 pages? But I think I just sort of let the story work itself out. I didn't really, I mean, I had an outline, but I did not. Okay, okay, sorry, I'm really bad at explaining this out loud. A lot of people talk about like the hero's journey or the, three act anything. I don't know what those are really. I mean, kind of, I have a sense. I don't plot things thematically or anything. I don't analyze pacing. I feel it. I write and I feel it as I go. And if it feels off, then I stop and I do whatever and I think about it and then I continue. Um, and later, when I started to work on book three, which may or may not ever happen, we can get to that. But I finally went back and I thought, okay, I need to actually analyze this. And when I sat down and really mapped it out, it actually worked pacing wise quite well. It's just that I sort of paced it by quote unquote experiencing it with the characters. And I just kind of another thing that I think is often said, don't do this, is to have multiple points of view. I mean, it's primarily Jossie at first, and then you hop around a little bit. But again, it's sort of a most things for me come from the characters, and so I just kind of instinctively went with what felt right, and it worked.
I'm with you that I like head hopping. I think that's a weird rule for people to have. I think one of the wonderful things about writing is, you can do thought and
Mhm.
internal response to things. So why wouldn't you want to show more than one character's perspective?
Oh yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
some more questions from the audience here. We have one from Robin, but Robin, I'm about to ask the same question actually, so I'm going to hold off for 1 second on that one. But we have another one from Krista here. You mentioned characters becoming more prominent, but did any characters disappear or end up being removed from the book?
Um, not be removed, but let me. So one of the guy with the glasses on the bus that I briefly mentioned, he his initial the way I initially thought of him is like 180 degrees different from how he ended up being. So sorry, excuse me. In that sense, I mean, some characters turned out vastly different than I thought. I would say he's probably the major one. Um, I didn't really remove anyone, and I don't think I really changed anyone. They all kind of made sense as I went along. I thought, okay, I need this, this makes sense for this person to show up. And that's, I guess, the key thing is that it has to make sense. I don't like it when people put in just to have conflict or to have, whatever. They just stick something in. That doesn't work for me. Like, it needs to make sense. Excuse me.
All right, and lastly, you touched on this briefly, but will there be a book three? Whether there is or not, what's coming up next for you, and what are you currently working on as far as your writing goes?
So I am really trying hard to write book three. The problem with book three, and I think I can mention this without spoilers, is that again with the head hopping, but I finally tried to explain to somebody how much effort it is to keep everyone's like everything pretty much in my mind all at the same time and try to just because it's again it's not so book three is I had to really think about the plot because I want some big thing to happen to the characters and them not to know why and they have to figure it out. And as I was writing, I was like, I also don't know why. Oh, that's bad. So I had to like reverse engineer books one and two and figure out things that I had mentioned briefly and then put together a plot that made sense. So it's more plot um structure driven than I wanted it to be because I want it to be a lot more character stuff, but there's plenty of character stuff as well. It's just a very strange. I have never had a linear plot where I don't know what order the scenes go in. And I realize it's because all of the scenes need to happen. They all address something that needs to happen with the characters, but I finally realized that the way that it works best to do it, I hope, is it has to build emotional tension, which is what I do in books one and two. And so it's almost like braiding. It's like you have to bring in each strand of related things and then it has a cumulative effect. But it's very odd to have a whole bunch of scenes and not know what order they go in because it is a linear progression, but it's like a kaleidoscope. I keep tilting it and I'm like, okay, that's almost right. So in that sense, it's been very frustrating. It's also just very hard because for me, it feels like method acting, but on paper. I am a terrible actress, but I think I can act on paper. And so again, 20 different characters all at the same time. And it's just a very intense process. So the other thing is just the scale of it. If you do read book two, which goes in a lot more depth into some of the social things I mentioned and just reflections and questions of, you know, right and wrong and things like that. This gets into that, but on a different scale. And so it's quite I want to do it justice. Like I don't want to release it unless I do it right. So no pressure or anything.
Well, we look forward to seeing what happens with that, and you'll have to keep in touch about whether book three happens or not. Thank you so much to SC Attwell, our guest for tonight. Thank you, audience, and your wonderful questions. Estus Book One, The City. Got to check it out. Links in the chat for that. And thank you again all so much for coming. We hope you join us for our next event, and make sure to look up SC Attwell and her wonderful books.